It began with something ordinary, something millions of people did every day. A quick swipe on a dating app. Daniel Mercer wasn't the kind of man who sought out danger. He worked as an IT consultant in Manchester, lived alone in a modest flat, and stuck to a routine so consistent that his friends could almost guess what he would be doing at any given hour. But one cold February evening, boredom got the better of him. He opened Tinder, scrolling past profiles that barely caught his attention, until he saw her, Emily Rhodes. She wasn't like the others. Her profile was sparse, almost deliberately so. A close-up photo of her face with eyes that seemed to hold something secret. A picture of her standing at the edge of a cliff somewhere coastal, and a single line in her bio. Life is short. Make it thrilling. Daniel felt an unfamiliar pull. She didn't list her job, didn't have the usual light-hearted captions, and didn't bother with long descriptions. It was as if she wanted people to wonder who she was, to lean closer, to ask questions. When he swiped right and saw the match notification appear almost instantly, he felt a flicker of excitement. They began exchanging short messages. Nothing deeply personal, nothing revealing, but Emily's tone was confident, playful and slightly teasing. She suggested meeting up sooner rather than later, as though waiting too long would ruin the spark. The arrangement was simple. Drinks at a trendy city center bar the following Friday. Daniel thought about the meeting all week, trying to decide what to wear and rehearsing casual conversation in his head. His friends were mildly surprised when he mentioned the date. Daniel wasn't known for impulsive decisions, especially with strangers from the internet. But they assumed it was harmless. That Friday, the temperature had dipped lower than expected. The streets were slick with rain from earlier in the day, reflecting the orange glow of streetlights. Daniel arrived early at the bar, checking his phone and scanning the entrance. When Emily walked in, the atmosphere seemed to shift. She wore a fitted red coat that drew every eye in the room. Her dark hair falling in loose waves, makeup precise but not overdone. There was something deliberate about her presence. She moved with quiet confidence, as though she'd already decided how the night would go. CCTV footage later showed them greeting each other with polite warmth. Daniel leaning in slightly, Emily offering a brief smile. They chose a small corner table where shadows softened the light and the noise of the crowd felt far away. From a distance they looked like any other couple on a first date, leaning in to hear one another, occasionally laughing, drinks in hand. Witnesses remembered Emily speaking more than Daniel, her voice steady, her posture composed. He seemed a little nervous at first but gradually relaxed. As the night went on, Emily's eyes darted occasionally toward the door. Once or twice she glanced at her phone, quickly typing something before sliding it back into her bag. To anyone watching casually, it was nothing unusual. People checked their phones all the time, but there was an edge to it, a tension she never fully disguised. Around midnight, the bill arrived. Daniel reached for it without hesitation. Emily smiled faintly, as though she'd expected that, and stood up before he'd even put his wallet away. She suggested they go somewhere quieter. According to later witness statements, Daniel hesitated briefly, but then agreed. They were seen walking side by side through the city streets, her red coat visible from a distance, his hands in his pockets. They headed toward a side street that led to a car park on the edge of the city center. It was less crowded there, the noise of bars and restaurants fading into the hum of distant traffic. The security camera mounted on the corner caught them passing by, Daniel glancing at Emily, Emily looking straight ahead. That grainy footage would be the last confirmed record of Daniel Mercer alive. When he didn't show up for work the following Monday, his colleagues assumed he was ill or taking a day off. But by Tuesday, his family had contacted police to report him missing. The match on Tinder, the drinks, the walk into the darkened street, all of it had seemed so ordinary. Yet within that ordinariness, something irreversible had already been set in motion. Something neither Daniel nor anyone close to him could have imagined. It had started with a simple swipe, and it would end in a way that would leave an entire city asking how such a small decision could lead to Britain's most shocking killing. At first, nothing about the rest of the evening seemed out of place to those who remembered seeing them. They had moved from the bright, noisy bar into the cool night air, the wet pavement shimmering under the streetlights. Emily walked slightly ahead, leading Daniel as if she already knew exactly where they were going. The route took them away from the main nightlife district, down quieter streets lined with shuttered shops and closed cafes. Daniel didn't seem uneasy, at least not from the way his body language appeared on the CCTV stills. He followed closely, occasionally glancing around, perhaps curious rather than concerned. They stopped briefly outside a late-night takeaway, the kind of small corner shop with bright fluorescent lighting and steamed-up windows. The owner later recalled them standing just beyond the doorway, not ordering food but speaking in low voices. Emily checked her phone several times, her thumb moving quickly over the screen before she slid the device back into her coat pocket. She never held Daniel's arm or made physical contact, something that stood out later to investigators. Despite being on a date, there was a formality to the space between them, as if the evening wasn't unfolding naturally but was instead following a plan she had in mind. From there, they turned toward the entrance of a multi-story car park. It was nearly empty at that hour, the low hum of fluorescent lights echoing in the concrete space. A single security camera captured them entering, the harsh lighting casting long shadows across the floor. Emily's steps were steady, her head turning slightly as if scanning the area. Daniel trailed a step behind, looking less certain now. Whether he sensed something was wrong in that moment is impossible to know. They disappeared from that camera's view just minutes later, walking toward the far end of the lot, where there were no other vehicles. The next camera picked them up briefly, Emily glancing toward an unlit stairwell, Daniel looking directly at her, before they were gone again. Those brief frames would later become crucial to piecing together his final movements. By the following morning, Daniel's phone had been switched off, its last signal traced to a location just outside the city. Oddly, the phone wasn't switched off immediately after the date, but roughly 20 minutes later, suggesting there was a short gap in time where something happened before it was disabled. Alongside this, investigators discovered that a different phone, an unregistered device later referred to as a burner phone, had pinged from a similar area during the same time frame. That phone was never recovered, but its existence hinted at coordination, that Emily wasn't acting alone. In the hours after leaving the bar, Emily's own digital footprint became strangely erratic. She was seen on CCTV near an ATM in a different part of the city, withdrawing a modest amount of cash. Her coat was the same, but her hair appeared tied back, and she was no longer carrying the small handbag she'd had earlier. That bag was never found. When police began interviewing witnesses, they found small but unsettling details. A rideshare driver recalled seeing a woman matching Emily's description entering the car park shortly after midnight, accompanied by a man, but leaving alone around 30 minutes later. He noticed she seemed calm, almost too calm, walking quickly toward a nearby side street, before disappearing from sight. This calmness, coupled with her controlled movements throughout the night, made investigators question whether Daniel's disappearance was spontaneous or part of a larger, deliberate scheme. The idea that someone could go from an ordinary date to vanishing within the span of a few hours unsettled even seasoned detectives. 2 days later, when Daniel's body was pulled from the River Irwell, the timeline became chillingly clear. He hadn't simply walked away from the car park. The signs of struggle on his body, defensive wounds on his arms and deep bruising along his ribs, suggested a violent confrontation. But what puzzled investigators was the lack of physical evidence tying Emily directly to the scene. No fingerprints, no DNA under Daniel's nails, no personal belongings left behind. Whoever had been responsible had taken time to remove almost every trace, which implied experience, or at the very least, guidance from someone who had done this before. The search for Emily became urgent, but by the time her name and face were circulated to the public, she had vanished. She didn't return to her flat. Her phone went dead. No friends or family claimed to have seen her. It was as if she had stepped off the map completely. The only thing that remained was the grainy trail of her final hours with Daniel, captured in fragments on security footage. A trail that began like an ordinary night out and ended in a place no one could have predicted. The sense of unease spread beyond those who knew Daniel. The idea that someone could lure an unsuspecting man to his death after a single night's meeting made headlines across the region. But the most disturbing question of all was still unanswered. Was Emily acting on her own, or was she just the visible part of something far more dangerous operating behind the scenes? The discovery came on a grey Sunday morning, when the River Elwell was running high from days of rain. A jogger following the towpath spotted something unusual caught against the reeds near a bend in the river. At first it looked like a bundle of rubbish, a black mass wrapped in torn plastic, drifting just enough to shift with the current. But as the jogger drew closer, the shape became unmistakably human. Panic set in. Emergency services were called, and within the hour, police and divers had cordoned off the area. The body was heavy with water. The layers of plastic sheeting wound tightly as if to conceal and preserve it. It took time to remove and secure it without damaging potential evidence. When the coverings were finally cut away at the morgue, the identification was swift. Dental records confirmed it was Daniel Mercer. The man whose face had been on missing posters for less than a week was no longer missing, but the state of his body told a story far darker than anyone had expected. The post-mortem revealed a brutal assault. Daniel had suffered multiple stab wounds to the torso, severe head trauma consistent with repeated blunt force strikes, and a fractured jaw. Defensive wounds marked his hands and forearms, deep cuts from trying to fend off a blade. The violence was personal, sustained and deliberate. It wasn't the quick work of a panicked attacker. It had been prolonged, almost methodical. Yet there were no usable fingerprints on the plastic or the bindings that had been used to wrap him. Whoever had done this had been careful, even clinical, in covering their tracks. What puzzled investigators was the condition of the bindings themselves. They were secured with layers of industrial tape, not something a person typically carried around. This suggested planning. More disturbingly, the way the knots were tied matched techniques often seen in organized crime cases, a detail the lead detective didn't release to the press. The timeline began to form more clearly. Based on water temperature and decomposition levels, Daniel had been dead for around 48 hours before being found. That meant he had been killed the same night he went missing, or early the next morning, then stored somewhere before being placed in the river. This removed the possibility of an impulsive attack in the heat of the moment. The killer had time and a secure location to prepare the body for disposal. Phone records became the next focus. Daniel's phone had gone silent around 12:40 a.m., roughly 20 minutes after he and Emily were last seen entering the car park. Investigators tracked its final signal to an area near an abandoned industrial site on the outskirts of the city, a place long known for illegal dumping and drug activity. Curiously, in that same 30-minute window, the burner phone signal appeared in the same vicinity before moving rapidly out of range. The industrial site was searched. Inside one of the larger buildings, police found faint traces of blood on the floor near a rusted metal table. Luminol tests lit up patterns that matched a violent struggle. Forensic analysis later confirmed the blood was Daniel's. However, no footprints, discarded clothing, or murder weapon were recovered. It was as if someone had cleaned the space deliberately before leaving, something that required both time and confidence. Another detail unsettled the investigative team. In a drain near the back of the warehouse, they found charred remains of what might have been fabric, mixed with melted plastic and fragments of burnt paper. Among the debris was the corner of what appeared to be a photograph too damaged to identify. Whether this had any direct connection to Daniel's killing remained unclear, but it suggested the destruction of something personal. The river itself added the mystery. The section where Daniel's body was found was not close to the industrial site, meaning he had been transported some distance before being placed in the water. Whoever had done it knew the area well enough to choose a spot where the current would carry the body further downstream, making discovery less likely. In the media, the story became more unsettling with each new detail. What had first been reported as a missing man case was now a clear, calculated killing with elements suggesting more than a simple crime of passion. Experts interviewed by the press speculated about motives, robbery gone wrong, revenge, or something more organized. Yet all the theories came back to the same problem. The one person last seen with Daniel was gone, and no one could say whether she had vanished out of guilt, fear, or obedience to someone even more dangerous. The case shifted from a straightforward hunt for a suspect to something broader, darker, and harder to define. It was no longer just about who had killed Daniel Mercer, but about what kind of network might have been behind it. The plastic, the knots, the careful disposal, these weren't the actions of someone improvising. They were the steps of someone who had done this before, and if that was true, then Daniel's death might not have been the first, and it was unlikely to be the last. The deeper the investigation went, the clearer it became that Emily Rhodes was not who she had claimed to be. The name on her Tinder profile led nowhere. No official records, no tax documents, no driving license. Even the photographs she had used were absent from social media, suggesting they had been taken specifically for that account. Detectives began running facial recognition checks through various databases, and that was when her real identity surfaced. She was Claire Henshaw, 31 years old, originally from Leeds, with a record that stretched back more than a decade. Her offenses included credit card fraud, identity theft, and burglary, but nothing as violent as what had happened to Daniel. Claire's past showed a pattern. She would move into a new city under a false name, often using dating apps or social circles to meet people quickly, then disappear once she had extracted money, possessions, or access to personal accounts. She had been arrested twice, but in both cases she was released on bail and vanished before her court date. The addresses she left behind were always temporary: sublet flats, rented rooms paid in cash, and in some cases, spaces belonging to people she had met only weeks before. When detectives looked into her most recent activity, they found that she had been living in Manchester for just under 3 months. During that time, there were at least 2 other men who had reported suspicious encounters through dating apps. One claimed she had stolen his wallet and used his bank card. Another alleged she had tried to persuade him to transfer money after claiming she was in trouble. In both cases, the victims had not pressed charges, assuming the amounts lost were too small to involve the police. The turning point came when investigators examined the abandoned industrial site where Daniel's blood had been found. In a corner of the warehouse, half hidden under a sheet of plywood, they discovered a handbag containing women's clothing. Inside was a UK passport with Claire's real name, but the photo page had been tampered with, as though she had been preparing to alter it. Alongside the passport was a small, prepaid phone and a notebook with a handful of first names and addresses, none of which appeared to belong to her. Tracing those names led police to something far more sinister. 2 of the men listed had previous connections to organized crime in the north of England, one a known loan shark, the other a suspected fence for stolen goods. The handwriting in the notebook was hers, but the addresses were in parts of the city she was unlikely to have entered alone. It suggested she was working with people who had resources, contacts, and the willingness to protect her activities. Detectives began building a profile. Claire was more than a lone scam artist. She appeared to be part of a small, shifting network of individuals who used dating apps to lure targets into vulnerable situations. Sometimes the goal was financial, sometimes it was to obtain leverage over the victim. In rare cases, it became violent. What happened to Daniel was beginning to look like one of those rare cases, but why it escalated to murder was still unclear. Financial records added another layer. 2 days after Daniel's disappearance, Claire withdrew over £3,000 in cash from multiple ATMs across the city. The money came from an account that had been opened only weeks before and shut down within hours of the withdrawals. CCTV showed her wearing different clothing at each location, sometimes with her hair down, sometimes tied up, clearly trying to disguise her movements. After the last withdrawal, there were no further sightings of her on any camera in Manchester. Investigators issued a national alert with her real name and the alias she had used with Daniel, but the trail went cold almost immediately. Leads came in from as far as Birmingham and Glasgow, but none proved reliable. The only consistent thread was that she had been seen in the company of a tall man in a dark coat, always keeping his face turned away from CCTV cameras. Some believed this was the broker, an unidentified figure whispered about in connection to the notebook's names, someone who arranged illicit work for people like Claire and ensured debts were collected, no matter the method. Despite the mounting evidence of her criminal ties, one fact gnawed at the investigators. Claire had never been linked to a killing before. If Daniel's murder was part of an organized job, it meant she had either crossed a line she never had before, or someone else had taken control of the situation. Either way, her disappearance made her both the prime suspect and, potentially, another victim. The media began to paint her as a femme fatale, a dangerous woman who seduced and destroyed. But within the investigation, the picture was more complex. Claire was dangerous, yes, but she was also connected to people far worse, and if those people had turned on her, then finding her would mean more than solving Daniel's murder. It might expose a chain of crimes stretching much further back than anyone realized. Just as investigators were preparing to widen the search across Europe, an unexpected lead emerged from a place no one had anticipated. A prison interview room. A man serving a sentence for armed robbery requested to speak with detectives working on the case, claiming he had information about Claire Henshaw. At first, they suspected it was another false lead from someone looking for a reduced sentence, but when he began describing details that had never been made public, the exact type of industrial tape used on Daniel's body, the position of the bindings, they knew he had been close to someone involved. According to his account, Claire had been working under the authority of a man known only as the broker, a shadowy figure who facilitated jobs for those willing to skirt or break the law. The broker's operations allegedly covered everything from fraud and blackmail to contract thefts. Claire was said to be one of several people who acted as lures, meeting targets in public, gaining their trust, and then delivering them into situations where they could be robbed, coerced, or otherwise exploited. The inmate claimed Daniel's case was not meant to end in murder. It was supposed to be a straightforward intimidation job. But something went wrong, and Claire's failure to complete it as instructed sealed her own fate. He said that hours after Daniel's death, Claire herself had been taken to a secluded location outside the city. Whether she was questioned, punished, or simply executed was unclear, but according to him, she never left that place alive. When pressed for more details, he refused to reveal the exact location, claiming it was suicide to name names. The detectives left the prison with little to verify his story, but the possibility that Claire had become a second victim could no longer be ignored. Weeks later, a breakthrough came from an entirely different direction. During a routine excavation of woodland for an unrelated investigation, police uncovered a shallow grave containing human remains. The body was badly decomposed, but forensic analysis confirmed it was female. DNA testing matched it to Claire Henshaw. Her remains were found wrapped in the same type of industrial plastic used on Daniel, and like him, she had suffered head trauma. There were no personal belongings, no jewelry, and her fingerprints had been deliberately removed. The parallels between their deaths were too exact to be coincidence. This revelation shifted the case into even more unsettling territory. The main suspect was now dead, killed in the same methodical, calculated way as her victim. The chain of events suggested a strict hierarchy. Someone gave orders, those orders weren't met, and the punishment was final, but the identity of that someone remained a blank space in the investigation. Every attempt to trace the broker led to dead ends. The names in Claire's notebook were either too cautious to speak or too afraid to admit they knew him. The public's perception of the case began to fracture. For months, Claire had been portrayed as a manipulative predator who had targeted Daniel for personal gain. Now, with her own murder confirmed, she appeared as both perpetrator and victim. A woman caught in a machine she might not have been able to escape. Commentators debated whether she deserved sympathy or condemnation. For Daniel's family, the revelation changed little. 2 people were dead, and the person who had orchestrated it all was still free. As the investigation dragged on, a haunting pattern emerged. Reviewing cold cases from the past 5 years, analysts found at least 4 unsolved murders with eerily similar traits. Bodies bound in industrial tape, wrapped in plastic, and dumped in secluded or waterlogged locations. The victims varied in age and background, but each had some connection to people on the fringes of criminal networks. This suggested that Daniel's death was not an isolated tragedy, but part of a series of operations carried out with the same precision and concealment. By the 1-year mark, the case had officially stalled. No new suspects were named. No arrests made. The broker remained a rumor whispered in certain circles, a figure whose existence was impossible to prove, but too consistent to dismiss. For the public, the story lingered like a half-finished sentence, a crime that had spiraled beyond its original boundaries and left nothing but questions in its wake. To this day, the sequence of events from the moment Daniel left the bar with Claire to the final moments of her own life remains a puzzle, with missing pieces. Theories abound that Daniel was targeted by mistake, that Claire had been planning to double-cross her employers, that the entire night was a setup gone wrong. None have been proven. What is certain is that 2 lives ended violently, their deaths linked by the same unseen hand. And somewhere out there, the person responsible walks free, their name known only to those who understand the cost of speaking it aloud. The case is remembered not only for its brutality, but for the way it blurred the lines between victim and perpetrator. It began with a Tinder date and ended in a double killing that remains one of Britain's most baffling and disturbing modern crimes. A reminder that sometimes the most dangerous part of a story is the chapter you never get to read.